We all know how difficult it is to understand native speakers in the language you're learning, especially when they're talking at regular speed. In a way, you need to work your way up to that. You might have been learning through an app, in which case it's highly likely you've been listening to AI-generated voices for your pronunciation. That's all well and good. They are getting better and better, but they don't always get it right, and they certainly don't have any regional accent. There are other ways of just listening to people actually speaking. Podcasts where the speech will be more natural if you go for one that's aimed at native speakers, but not regular conversational speed. Learning podcasts will always be slower and clearer and simpler in terms of language. And there's radio, which might be totally incomprehensible to start with, because much of it will be at conversational speed. But have you ever considered trying to listen to an audiobook? I've listened to a lot of audiobooks recently, from the very easy to full-length adult novels, and I've refined my thinking on the subject. These are my suggestions on how you can work your way up from listening to very simple children's books to listening to more complex adult novels, which will be a lot closer to conversational speed, and all will require you to get the gist of what's being said without the opportunity to ask the speaker. Now, I'm not going to lie, listening to audiobooks isn't easy. You have no mouth to watch, for example. You don't realise how important that is until you don't have it. Okay, just a note here. Some audiobooks these days are narrated by an AI voice. I think most distributors require uploaders to indicate that it's an AI voice, but people are supposed to do that on YouTube and don't always do it. So do try to make sure you're listening to a real voice. Most voice actors will have a presence on the web, so it shouldn't be too difficult to confirm it's a real person if you're doubtful. And it's probably only going to be independent writers who use AI voices at present. So if there's a recognised publisher's name, it's more likely to be a real person. Not guaranteeing that though. Second note. I would not recommend starting to listen to audiobooks until you've done a lot of regular reading of books in the language you're learning. You need to get comfortable with the way people write in the language. You need to get used to the type of vocabulary they use. You need to get used to the literary tenses, like the French ones I spoke about recently. You also need to have done a lot of other listening to those other things I mentioned earlier, like podcasts and radio, plus TV programs and possibly films, where you can get help with what's being said. But audiobooks. Ideally, you need to start off with easier audiobooks that would be ones meant for children in the main. The stories tend to be quite short and don't use very complex language. They also tend to be slower, but not always. You can also find short non-fiction, which may be meant for a slightly older audience and have slightly more difficult language. I have videos about a number of both of these types of audiobooks on my channel, and I'll be continuing to post more. Obviously, you're never going to understand every word that's being said. You wouldn't even do that if you were reading the text. The aims are to understand the gist of what's being said, to understand the story as a whole, not that one descriptive word that you've never heard before, and to get used to listening to the spoken language, spoken by a real person. The biggest problem with children's books, though, especially ones for the youngest kids, is that you will often have to put up with musical interludes and very exaggerated speech. So I wouldn't listen to a ton of these. Just use them as a stepping stone to something more complex and to prove to yourself that you can understand the story. So start with simple and short. That way you can listen again if you need to without losing too much of your listening time on whatever service you're using. Yes, I would recommend using a service that gives you a number of hours of listening time rather than a number of books. That way, if it's not working, you can abandon it and go on to something else. I use Spotify for listening, which gives me 15 hours of listening time, and they have plenty of books in other languages than English. Right, back to the audiobooks again. Starting to listen to more complex audiobooks can be a very daunting thing. I know, I've done it, and a lot depends on the narrator, to be honest. If the narrator doesn't speak crisply and clearly all the time, and they might not if they're doing accents for particular characters, then it can become very difficult to understand. But you can build up to that, which I didn't initially do when I tried out a few books a couple of years back, because we all live and learn. I now have, I think, 3 videos on my channel where I talk about having listened to books I've read before. One of them is about Pinocchio, where I found a simplified version of the story and listened to that, because the original is not easy to read even on paper. The others are full-length novels I originally read as an ebook. All these are in Italian. I started off with the language I'm most comfortable with, of course. After having done this, I think my suggestion would definitely be, in order to up the difficulty to the next level, is to listen to an audiobook of something you've read before. You'll know the story, so you don't have to worry so much about understanding all the words, and it will be a more relaxing listen. Because yes, trying to understand can be stressful, even if it's not a face-to-face conversation, because your brain is trying desperately to squeeze the meaning out of something, and being stressed will probably make the task more difficult. If you're doing this though, try to listen to it as fast as possible. I don't mean more than 1 times speed, but if you have to slow it down to start with, try pushing it up gradually as you get used to the voice. Because yes, getting used to the narrator's voice is a thing, just like getting used to the narrative voice is a thing. Both will make it more difficult at the beginning of a book. Some people, of course, listen to a book whilst reading the text. I have to say, I don't think this is the best idea for improving your comprehension long term, because you're relying on the text to understand, not the listening. My recommendation would be to read the text first, looking up the things you don't know, where necessary, and then listen to the book. And I don't mean straight away. Those books I mentioned that I'd read before, there were years between reading and listening. So that shouldn't be an issue. In fact, it might be better, because you will prove to yourself that you're understanding what you're hearing rather than just remembering very clearly every single thing, because you only just read it. Then, of course, comes listening to something longer that you haven't read before. This will potentially be a never-ending next step. I have recently finished listening to the first book in an Italian science fiction series without having read it in its entirety previously. What I did do, though, was after having listened to the first 3 chapters, I downloaded the sample off Amazon and read that, just to make sure I was getting this world right. I have a full video where I discuss that here. This might be an interim stage you could use. The beginnings of books aren't only difficult because of the narrative style and the narrator's voice, they're also difficult because of the world building that happens, whatever genre you're consuming, but especially with fantasy and science fiction. Just think about all those weird names and made-up words. Yes, my favourite genres are probably the most difficult to understand. After doing that, my mind was much clearer on what I was listening to, and I managed to follow the story reasonably successfully. There were a few points where I had to readjust my understanding because I'd clearly missed something, but not many. And that's something else you need to be aware of. It's not just understanding every word, it's about the nature of listening. From time to time, your mind will wander. You can't help it. It's just one of those things. And when your mind wanders, you miss things without even realizing it. I find the best way to avoid this after you're used to the narration is to do something else whilst listening, like the dishes, or gardening, or whatever it is you do that is not something you have to think about much. This might seem counterintuitive, but it can help. Try it and see, but only after you're used to the voice. I have also done the reading the sample thing with a French young adult science fiction book, my first foray into listening to something longer in French. Again, I went for an author I'd read before, but not a book I'd read before this time. French, I would say, is a lot more difficult to get the meaning of when you don't know the voice of the narrator, because French doesn't pronounce every letter on the page, like some other Romance languages. I had a bit of a problem understanding the details of the world or recognising the names. I wrote down all the names that came up in the sample and some details about the world, which I added to as I continued to listen. But I had to concentrate on this one far longer before I could go off and do the chores. But I did get there, before I was halfway through the book. I know I understood less of the details than in the Italian books, but I still enjoyed the story. I have also listened to a middle grade book in Italian without having read it, which was over 2 hours, and I didn't need any of that. I actually read that before those last 3. That turned out to be a favourite book of mine for this year so far. I understood a huge amount of that book, probably more than any of the others, and it really kept me engaged. The thing is, there will be swings and roundabouts when listening to audiobooks. Some books will be a lot easier than others just because of the choice of vocabulary of the author and the voice of the narrator. Some books you'll totally get on with, others you won't. Again, another reason to use a service that gives you a time limit, not a book limit, because if something isn't working, you can quit and start something else. To make things easier, as well as choosing authors you've read before, try searching out narrators you've listened to before and found the easiest to understand. And of course, always use headphones, because then you'll have the best chance of hearing everything that's being said. Background noise will not help you to understand. And one last thing. Of course, I don't understand everything. And this needs saying over and over because people think they need to understand everything. You don't need to. It's impossible. This is a foreign language. You just need to understand the story. And that's a different thing entirely.